Welcome to Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we explore Lexington's history and people. I'm your host, David Bryant, and in each episode, we will feature a guest who will share a piece of local history. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Now I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is David Bryant, and I'm currently the manager of the Central Library in Lexington, Kentucky. Miriam is taking some time to focus on the library's other podcast, Turning the Page, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to host Tales from the Kentucky Room. Some of you may know me from the Kentucky Room, where I assist library patrons with local history and genealogy questions. I've also appeared on several previous episodes of Tales from the Kentucky Room. Local history and genealogy are a passion of mine, and I'm thrilled about the opportunity to explore these topics with you. In 2025, Lexington, Kentucky will celebrate its 250th birthday, and the city is planning many events to celebrate, and Lexington Public Library is working with the city to plan these events. Today, we're talking to podcast regular Wayne Johnson. Wayne is Lexington's expert on all things Lexington history related, and he has compiled a list of 250 notable Lexingtonians and 250 notable events from Lexington history. Wayne is here today to talk about his top 10 notable events. Welcome to the podcast, Wayne.
Thanks, David.
All right. So to get started, I thought it'd be interesting if you could talk a little bit about how you research your list of the 250 notable events.
Well, we got started about 5 or 6 years ago with the idea of coming up with a 250 list for events and for people. And it started with our Lexington History Roundtable group that would meet, every 2 months or so here at Central Library and talk about local history. And from that, we had a couple sessions on, who are the most notable people in the history of Lexington? We had a meeting about that, and everybody exchanged ideas. So a lot of credit for these events and people goes back to the group of about 8 or 9 of our regulars on the local history roundtable group. Credit goes to them. They mention events that people I'd never even thought of. So that's where it really got started. We knew, even back then, we started thinking about, hey, the 250 is coming up in 2025. Let's do something like this.
Okay, so it sounds like it was kind of a group effort.
Yeah, yes. I would say it is. A lot of credit has to go to, I won't mention them by name. They know who they are if they're listening to this, but the local history roundtable group played a big part in it.
Okay, so when you look at 250 years of a city's history, that's a lot of time. So how did you go about narrowing down the list to the top 10?
That was really hard. When we were talking about doing a podcast, I said, well, I can't put in order the 10 top people in the history of Lexington. I didn't want to deal with that. People were going to, it just would have really been difficult. But I said, we could probably do the top 10 events in Lexington's history out of the 250 that we have on our list. I thought to myself, that might be, it was still hard, believe me, but it'd be easier than listening to top 10 people in the history, because there's just so many people that have contributed in our 250 years to our history. So I thought just the top 10 events would be easier to do, and that's what I've done. And I've said this is before. This is a subjective list. This is from my experiences, my opinions. You can get 10 different people to put together a list, and I doubt if any of them would match totally somebody else's list. So this is just from my perspective. My work in the Kentucky Room all these years, and also just growing up here in Lexington and just having an interest in local history. But I don't pretend to be, excuse the comparison, I don't pretend to be Moses coming down with the mountain with his list of 10. So this is very subjective, and I hope...
Absolutely. It's a great conversation starter to get people started talking about history.
For sure, and that's one of the goals here, is to get people interested in our history of Lexington in the last 250 years.
Okay, so let's go ahead and delve into your events. Now, I think you mentioned these events, they're not necessarily ranked, or are you going to do that?
I went ahead and ranked them
Okay.
just as for fun.
All right.
And like I said, it's a subjective list.
Very good.
And when I've done the rankings for like the last month, and every day I sat down, I would change things here and there. I had some input from somebody I'll mention later that suggested I put this particular event on there, and it made sense, so I put it on. But yeah, anybody can. It's hard to rank them, but I went ahead and did it anyway, just for the podcast.
All right. Do you want to go ahead and start
Sure.
going down your list?
Sure.
All right.
I'll be like David Letterman's top 10 list.
Exactly.
And we'll start with number 10. May 21st, 1930. Adolph Rupp hired as a UK basketball coach. Sports has been huge in Lexington's history, and that includes horse racing. I found it hard I didn't want to have all the events be sports in the top 10, so I had to choose one. Horse racing and the opening of Kingland was also a big event, but I had to choose one, and I decided to choose the hiring of Adolph Rupp as UK basketball coach. People here in Lexington and in the state of Kentucky, and actually nationally, know how important basketball is to our state and our city, UK basketball. And it all started with Adolph Rupp. He was the baron of basketball. He's the guy that started. His 40 years of success here, national titles. He just put UK basketball on the map. And not only did he put UK basketball on the map, he also had a profound impact on basketball in the South and nationally and even globally. When he died in December of 1977, at the time he was the winningest basketball coach.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would argue that Adolph Rupp and basketball are not totally linked to Lexington.
Yeah, and I know we've all heard the term Big Blue Nation. Well, it's a real thing.
Uh-huh.
Okay, it's a real thing out there. Anybody that follows UK basketball, I don't think would question this as a number 10.
Definitely not. So, number 9?
Number 9, December 7th, 1968. Now, this one might catch a lot of people that don't know Lexington history by surprise. But on that date, we had something called the Track Relocation Day celebration. And that was when the downtown railroad tracks began removal of the tracks in downtown Lexington. Now, we all know the railroad played a very important role in Lexington's history dating back to 1831 when the first rail was laid. And we had train stations downtown, including Union Station, which opened in 1907 and closed in 1957. A great year, 1957. I'm dating myself here. But, railroads were a very important mode of transportation. But, as we got further into the 20th century, automobiles and airplanes kind of took over from the railroads for, people moving around. But we still had the tracks in downtown Lexington, and this was preventing Lexington, their urban renewal project, from growing. Lexington, as we know it today, would not have been without getting rid of the railroad tracks. Well, anyway, that event was huge. They had a big celebration on that date. They had bands, marching bands, and they had, I think, over 1,000 people attended. And it was a huge event. Mayor Fugazi, he was a commissioner at the time, played a big part in negotiating with the C&O and I think L&N railroads to, help with the payment of getting rid of the tracks. And then Happy Chandler, of course, had a big part in negotiating with the C&O, I think. But it was a big event.
Absolutely. And I think some longtime Lexingtonians still talk about the living with the tracks and crossing them.
Yeah. And I remember, getting caught in, not that I was driving, but in our car, getting caught with the trains, coming through. And there was always traffic jams, in the afternoon when people were leaving for work. And so we had to get rid of the tracks. They played a big part in our history, but it was time to move on. And this day really signifies the change of old Lexington downtown to what we are today. We're actually here at the library just behind us was the old, would be the railroad tracks.
So, number 8?
Number 8, August 15th through the 17th, 1782, the siege of Bryan Station. Bryan Station was an early Lexington settlement. I guess it's probably about 4 miles north of downtown Lexington, and there's a marker out there if anybody's interested to go out and see it. Well, during the Revolutionary War, several hundred Indians, Tories, and Canadian Rangers, led by, among others, Captain William Caldwell and Simon Girty, covertly surrounded the station, hoping to invade it and take it over and get a place in Lexington for their activities. Well, they were preparing to attack the fort and were hoping to draw the defenders outside the fort. And there's a famous story about how the defenders of the fort sent the women out to the spring to get water. It was in the summer and they needed water. And even though they knew that the Indians and the Canadians were out there waiting to ambush them, but they did not know that the defenders knew they were there. So they sent the women out, as they normally did, to get the water, to kind of trick the invaders that, hey, we don't know you're out there. So anyway, they finally did attack. They sent 2 messengers to downtown Lexington to get some reinforcements, and they repelled the attack. And then the reinforcements came, and they chased them all the way up to in Robinson County to the Blue Licks battlefield. Anybody knows their Revolutionary War history knows what happened after that. It was a complete disaster for our side. Anyway, the siege of Bryan Station is where it all got started. And I have to commend a former employee here, Walter Bowman, who's an archivist for the Kentucky Department of Military Affairs. He actually was the one that suggested, hey, we got to have the siege of Bryan Station in, and we kind of went back and forth. And it was on my list of 250 notables, but you can't fit everything into top 10. But he convinced me that it deserves to be on the top 10.
Well, it's definitely one of those events where the area as we know it may not exist.
Yeah, exactly.
Happens, so.
I even told him, I said, but Walter, they went up to Blue Licks and they got kind of, beat up. And he said, that doesn't matter. The siege of Bryan Station needs to be on that list. And I said, okay. He's very knowledgeable of all things military history here in the state of Kentucky. So I really respect his opinions on that. And he was a great help for that.
All right. Number 7?
Number 7, very sad event, August 27th, 2006. The Comair crash at the Bluegrass Airport. It was Sunday morning around 6 a.m. Comair Flight 5191 with 50 people aboard, heading to Alaska, crashed at the end of the runway number 26 at the airport, killing 49 out of the 50 aboard. The only survivor who was severely injured was the co-pilot. He had severe injuries, had his leg amputated, but he survived. And this was the worst airport crash in the history here in Lexington. We had one in April 3rd, 1967, where 9 people were killed. But up until this Comair crash, that was the worst disaster. But the Comair disaster really impacted the community. It's like Mayor Isaac said later, she said that we sympathize with the friends and the families of the victims. And then she added, we are the family and the friends of the victims. That it just had a big impact on Lexington because so many Lexingtonians were on the flight, and of course other people too. So it was really a devastating event. The National Transportation Safety Board finally concluded about a year later that the pilots took the wrong runway. They took the shorter runway, 26, instead of runway 22, which was longer and was meant for commercial airliners. So basically the findings were pilot error was the main cause. They just got on the wrong runway. At the time we only had the airport only had one air traffic controller up in the tower. I think they eventually said we need 2 up there. And I think the regulations at the time were you had to have 2. Airport only had 1, and not sure if that would have prevented the crash, but extra eyes never would hurt in a situation like that. It was a perfect storm for a tragic event. It's
Yeah, it was truly tragic. And it's one of those things where anyone living in Lexington really remembers hearing about it, like where they were and what they were doing when they heard about it.
And this was the first major airline crash after 9/11, with the exception of New York City had one like a couple months after 9/11. But there weren't any major airline crashes from November 2001 until this took place in 2006. And if you're ever out at the Arboretum walking around, there's a memorial out there for all the victims of the crash.
Okay.
And it was just a heartbreaking event for Lexington.
Yeah. All right. Number 6.
Number 6. Okay. People who don't know their business history may not understand this one, but here goes. June 29th, 1956. IBM announces that they're coming to Lexington. This was huge. Noted Kentucky professor Carl Cohn noted in the newspaper about this event that it was a revolution. It changed the whole character of Lexington. It was the industrial revolution of Lexington. Up to that time, we were basically a small college town, had the tobacco industry and agriculture, but this really got Lexington started on industry. And, it led the way for other businesses like Dixie Cup, Square D, Train to come into Lexington. And I grew up in Lexington in the 60s, and I was born in 57. I don't really remember the old time Lexington from before IBM got there, but in the 60s, you saw how Lexington was growing, the neighborhoods, its suburban growth, the better schools, the more schools. There was a lot of activity, and you can trace it back to businesses like IBM coming to town. It really just transformed Lexington.
And it brought lots of people to the area.
Oh, yeah.
Correct?
Yeah. Yes. I think the first hire at the time was like they brought in, don't quote me on this, but even though you can quote me because I'm on tape here, I think it's like 1,800 employees came here at the start. And, their kids needed schools to go to. And I went to school with plenty of them. And, I just remember growing up in the 60s, all you heard about was IBM. So it was really a transformation of Lexington's economy from a small college town, tobacco-based industry, horse racing-based industry, to a industrial industry. It was a huge event.
Right. All right. Number 5.
And number 5 is going to be February 9th, 1920, the courthouse riot. This infamous event in Lexington's history had its origins on February 5th, 1920, when a 10-year-old Geneva Hardeman, heading to her school near South Elkhorn, was murdered on her way to school. Her battered body was soon found, and a man by the name of Will Lockett was quickly arrested. He was brought to the courthouse here in downtown Lexington and put on trial. Well, anyway, the threats of mob violence were everywhere, and it caused the Kentucky governor to call up troops to protect the murderer, during his trial. And apparently the mob, there's still questions about what happened, how it got started, whether a photographer flashed a camera and got people riled up, or somebody in a crowd decided to rush to the courthouse. But the troops started firing on the mob, and I think a total of 5 people were killed and 20 or so were injured.
Wow.
And you can still go to the courthouse. You really have to, the old courthouse, corner of Upper and Main Street. You can still see the pocket marks of the bullets. You really have to look closely, but you can still see the pocket marks of the bullets on the front of the courthouse. And it was really a tragic event. When I put together the list, I didn't want to have like 10 crime stories or 10 sports stories or 10 political stories. So I tried to, pick one from each. And I had to choose between this one. It came down to this one and the murder of Marion Miley, which was also a huge event from 1941. And I just, went with the courthouse riot. It was a huge event, very tragic. The murderer was eventually actually confessed to the crime, confessed to some other murders and was executed the following month. They did things really quick back in those days as far as execution. You didn't have to wait like you have today. But
Kentucky has a history of lots of courthouse violence and riots. And Lexington has its share of those things. So.
This group was intent on getting the murderer out of there and doing something to him, but the troops prevented them from doing it. But anyway, that's number 5 on my list.
All right, and moving on up to 4.
Number 4, January 1st, 1974. The Lexington-Fayette-Urban County government merger begins on that date. Now, prior to that, we had a dual system of governments. We had the city government with the mayor and commissioners, and we had a county government led by the judge executive. At the time of the merger, it was Robert Stevens, who the new courthouse was named after. So you had 2 different political systems. You had the city and you had the county, and this caused a lot of inefficiency in services provided to our community. Lexington, it came at a perfect time because Lexington was really reaching its, major growth period. And it was just the way we had the government systems broken down into city and county. It was just a very inefficient way of doing things. Now, Lexington, we have a book by William Lyons, who was one of the leaders of the merger. Was a professor over at UK, and we have a book about the merger, how it came to be. It's really interesting to read. Mergers were not very successful when they tried them in other cities of our size or even larger. And we were one of the first, if I remember history correctly, we were really one of the first that turned it into a success. And it didn't come overnight. We had government officials create a petition where we could put a referendum on our ballot in November of 1972, and the Lexington citizens voted on it. They said we wanted a merger. They voted for a merger. I think the vote was like 2-1, something like that. But that's how it got started. Had to go through a lot of court battles and so forth. But anyway, the services of the city and the county were merged. Now, prior to that, we had 2 different school systems, and we merged those before the official merger. Same with the police department and the fire department. They had county departments and city departments, and they merged. But the merger, like I said, came at a very important time, and it just made us more efficient.
Do you know if the Fayette County LFUCG merger, did that have any effect on Jefferson County, Louisville Metro?
Yeah, they eventually merged, didn't they? Yeah. I'm sure it probably did. Because before we did our merger, we went and studied other cities who had tried it and apparently were unsuccessful with it. But I'm sure Jefferson County saw what we did and probably took some lessons from it. But the urban county government that we have today with the mayor and 15 council people was a direct result of the merger.
Mm-hmm. That can be another podcast topic.
Yeah. Well, we actually did a podcast on the merger a few years ago, and a lot of these topics, I think we've done a podcast on some of them just because they're just so important in Lexington's history.
Absolutely.
Number 3, turning my pages here. You all can relate to this, work in the Kentucky room. August 11th, 1787, the Kentucky Gazette publishes its first issue. The Kentucky Gazette was the first newspaper published in Kentucky. I've also heard it's the first newspaper west of the Alleghenies, but I think there's some questions about that. But it was definitely the first newspaper in the state. And at the time, we were debating having conventions on becoming a state. Prior to that, we were part of your home, Virginia, and we had a convention. And the delegates in the convention decided that we need a newspaper to, get public opinion behind a push for statehood. And that's how the Kentucky Gazette came about. John Bradford was the first publisher, famous Lexingtonian. And now no known copy of the first issue of the Kentucky Gazette is known to exist.
We're still looking for that.
We're still looking for that. I'm definitely retiring when I find that one. The last one, I think, burned up in a fire a long time ago. But we here at the Kentucky Room have the second issue that came out the next week. It was a weekly issue. And it was basically a reprint of the first issue. And we actually have the physical copy.
Uh-huh.
And, papers, and the reason why I rate this so highly is newspapers are so important to the history of Lexington. We have a lot of them here in the Kentucky Room on microfilm. You have the Observer and Reporter, the Lexington Daily Press, the Lexington Leader, the Lexington Herald Leader. And all of these can be accessed here in the Kentucky Room through microfilm, going back to the very first Kentucky Gazette issue that we have. So that's my marketing comment for our Kentucky Room. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, the Kentucky Room is definitely your go-to place to learn all things Lexington history.
Yeah. And in addition to the microfilm, we do have some digitized online, and we have hard copies as well of a number of historic newspapers as well.
Yes.
So definitely stop by.
I always say that our Kentucky Room is the hub of Lexington history. I know we have we have the Lexington History Museum, which does a great job and so forth, but
we're partial to it.
Well, yeah, we believe in our Kentucky Room.
Yeah. Number 2.
Okay. Number 2. Pandemics, epidemics, whatever you want to call them. This is the one thing that I combined because I wanted to fit both of them in. And number 2 is the 1833 cholera and the 2020 and beyond COVID. I just felt it was important to get both of those on there. The cholera that hit Lexington on June 3rd, 1833 had a devastating impact on Lexington. I think 1/10 of our population was killed by it.
Wow.
And many left the city in droves because of fear of the cholera. We all have heard this, or most of us have heard the story of King Solomon, who was one of the few that stayed behind and buried the dead. And he was a vagrant here in town, but turned out to be the hero of the 1833 cholera. Now, the cholera was not just limited to Lexington. It was nationwide, and I think even started in Canada, if I remember correctly. So it wasn't just a Lexington event, but it happened. It happened in Lexington also. COVID, what can I say about that? We've all lived. Anybody listening, old enough to listen to this podcast, knows the impact that COVID has had. It changed the way we lived, changed the way the kids were educated, changed the way we worked, how we shopped, how we interacted with other people, wearing masks, which was not a fun thing to do. And can't forget about the COVID vaccines. Nursing homes, you tried to, people, they restricted nursing home visits because it really hit the elderly pretty badly.
And just backtracking a little, the 1833 cholera epidemic, that was one of a number of cholera outbreaks. Was that the worst one?
Here in Lexington, it was. We had one in 1849, which was almost as bad, but didn't quite take the number of lives. I think we learned some stuff from the 1833 and 1849 cholera about how it was caused. I think it dealt with water and the privies and how the water would get contaminated. So we learned a lot from those epidemics.
It's just a great reminder that these pandemics continue. They're with us.
Yeah. I debated what to say about COVID because I'm just going to say, hey, you lived it, make your own conclusion. I mean, it changed everything. Just from a personal standpoint, it was for the first few weeks, it was a scary time. It's like you didn't want to go get too close to people and you wanted to make sure you had a mask. But I felt it important to get those two on there together. Now, when I came up with this list, I really, things like world wars and the Civil War and the Vietnam War, all these had impacts on Lexington because we had young men and women going off to war. But it didn't actually take place in Lexington, what I tried to do but it had impact on Lexington. And what I try to do with my list is pick things that actually happen inside Lexington.
Mm-hmm.
And
absolutely.
But that's not to say the wars and things like that didn't have an impact because you can go out to Camp Nelson and see the impact that wars have on the community.
So are we ready for number one?
We are ready for number one. And in a nod to Julie Andrews, I feel like it's important to start at the beginning, and that's June 4th and 5th, 1775, the naming of Lexington at McConnell Springs. That's my number one thing because that's where everything started. Everything that's come afterwards is a result of that campfire meeting where some pioneers gathered and had just heard about the Battle of Lexington in April 1775, and news traveled slowly back in those days, and they were around a campfire deciding what to call the settlement they wanted to start, and they got the letter about the Battle of Lexington and said, hey, somebody was really creative in this group, said, let's just call it Lexington. And that's how we came up with our name of Lexington. That's how it all got started. In my mind, it's number one.
Yeah, I think it'd be hard to argue with that.
yeah, because it was where, it's like Neil Armstrong is the greatest moonwalker because he was the first one. The first is always the one to carry, or Charles Lindbergh is the greatest Atlantic flyer of all time because he was the first one. Now, it was really hard to just narrow it down to 10, and there was just a couple honorable mentions.
I was going to ask you if you had a few of.
And you can relate to this because it was huge at the time, and you actually did a podcast on it. The Lafayette visit in May of 1825 was a huge event, very popular. I always compare it to a younger crowd. Just ask your grandparents about when the Beatles came to America in 1964. That's how big the Lafayette visit was. And you've done research on it. You know all about that. Also, the Henry Clay funeral, who, he was huge in our history in 1852. Thousands and thousands of people attended his funeral here in Lexington and his burial in the Lexington Cemetery. And that was one that was considered to be on the list. And again, this is just from my perspective. And I mentioned earlier about Kingland. Horse racing is just so important to Lexingtonians, and the opening of Kingland on October 15th, 1936 was a huge event also. And horse racing still remains a very important part of our society. And I mentioned the murder of Marion Miley.
Yeah, can you remind people? Some people may not remember who
Marion Miley. I always label her as the Amelia Earhart of Lexington. Potential left unfilled because of an early death. She was a noted golfer, a woman golfer here in 1930s, early 40s. And she and her mother were at the Lexington Country Club. That's where they lived. And some burglars broke in September 28th, 1941 on Saturday night, right after a big dance party, thinking there would be a lot of money there. And they broke in early in the morning and killed Marion Miley and her mom with a gunshot. Now, her mother actually survived for a couple of days and actually walked all the way from the Lexington Country Club across the street to a sanitarium to get help. I don't know how she did it, but she was able to do it. But Marion Miley was it was just so tragic because she was only 27 years old. She had her whole life in front of her and like I said, just unfilled potential because of the tragic death. But it would have been interesting to see what she would have done. And I had one other one mentioned here, and it still is very impactful today, is KET going on the air in September 1968. Really major impact on the education of Kentuckians. And you could list several more. You might have some that you're partial to, and there's just so many events that have impacted Lexington.
That's a good transition into it. We're going to make the full list available to people. It's a great conversation starter. It's a great way to learn about your local history. And also, I wanted to ask you, how did you do most of your research?
I just, for the people, the 250 notable people, again, a lot of credit has to go to the Lexington History Roundtable group because we sat there for like 2 hours just discussing names, and I took a list and went out and started researching them. And like I said, there were names mentioned. I'm like, I didn't know that. There's one guy who was the director of the Patterson School of Diplomacy that was mentioned, who actually helped write the Charter of the United Nations. So I was fascinated with all this stuff I was learning. So I took all these names and compiled them, and I either got newspaper articles about them or their obituaries when they passed on. One of the requirements to be on this list is you have to be dead, because I started putting the list together originally and was including modern day people, and I'm like, this is impossible because I can't include this person without including that person. So I finally just decided to just
cut it off.
Cut it off to the people that have passed on.
And that they had lived here a certain amount of time.
Yes, I actually used the Bear Bryant model of inclusion. Bear Bryant was a coached here at UK for like 7 or 8 years, and I'm like, okay, somebody was here 7 or 8 years, I can include Bear Bryant. So that's pretty much, you either had to be born in Lexington or did a good amount of work here in Lexington or stayed here for 7 or 8 years at the least, and then unfortunately passed on. But these are very notable people in our history. As far as the events, again, the local history roundtable helped out with our discussions, and I just based on my experience and their input and just all these years of working here in the Kentucky room, running across these, I just said, okay, here's what I think. We're putting them all together, newspaper articles on each event or each person, or a book article, either one, and we're going to compile them. They should be ready sometime in January, where people can come down and, do a school paper, or somebody's just interested in Lexington history can come and look at it. And it's not meant to include every newspaper article about the event. We have the resources here if you want to learn more about a certain event. That'll get you started. And we have excellent librarians here in the Kentucky room that can find other material for you.
Yeah, definitely. And we're planning additional programming to go along with the events as well. So I do encourage everyone to keep an eye out on our calendar for these events coming up.
I like the way the programming folks have come up with the dedicated topic each month. You want to talk about that?
Sure. So actually, that's through the city. They've come up with a different theme for each month. Some of the ones that I can remember off the top of my head, January is wellness, February is history. I think April is literature. And then, there's other months, music and art. So, across our library system, we're going to have at the various branches programming related to these topics. It's also related to Lexington culture and history. So we're pretty excited about that. There'll be more information coming out about that at some point. Another thing,
I just think the Lexington 250 celebration is going to be just great for people of the community to learn about our history that we just didn't, form out of the blue one day. It took a lot of people and a lot of events to lead to where we are today. And I think it's going to be a great celebration.
Wayne, I've learned so much today. Your knowledge of Lexington history always impresses me. Did you have any other topics you wanted to comment on at this point?
Only to reemphasize that this is all subjective. Your list, you could come up with a list completely different than mine. And I encourage people that have an interest in Lexington history to create your own list. Feel free to come down and show it to me. It doesn't have to be the list that I came up with. I expect it to be people who have different perspectives depending on your how you look at it. I do think out of this list that we just talked about in the top 10, I would say there's a core of 6 or 7. If you're really going to have a serious top 10 list, there's 6 or 7 of those events we just mentioned have to be on the list, in my opinion. There's a couple that you can, say, well, maybe not. But anyway, that's my list. I'm sticking with it. It's actually, for me, as I'm entering my last couple months here at the library, it's been a blast researching it. I love researching Lexington history, and it's just been so much fun. And if you have fun doing something and you have even a little bit of sense and intelligence, which I'll claim a little bit, that you're going to do a good job with it.
Yeah, it's like we said earlier, it's a great conversation start.
Yes, feel free to come down to the Kentucky room if you want to say, hey, what about this event or that event? And we can help you research and And I like talking with Walter about the Siege of Bryan Station. It's just a great way to and I laughed at him when he told me. I said, well, Walter, you're proving exactly what I want to do with this is get discussion started. Feel free if you're listening to this podcast and want to come down and talk about it. We'll be here.
Well, Wayne, it's been great talking with you today. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, David.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcast. And please remember to recommend the podcast to friends. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm. Or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm David Bryant, and we'll be back with another episode next month.